Hello, I'm Sky Matsuhashi, founder of SmartPokerStudy.com, the place for poker players who are always striving to be better today than they were yesterday. Poker people, last week's episode 119, it was some commentary from a 25NL session that I played. I made some good plays and some mistakes, but I talked some valuable strategy throughout, so give it a listen. Hey, poker people, here it is, finally, minimum effective dose number 4, class 3, the final class. Today we're going to be discussing something that troubles players all the time. It's blind versus blind play, baby. Yep. Whether you are a cash, MTT, or sit-and-go player, we get into these situations time and time again. So, let's get to it. Class number 1, back in episode 110, that was all about pre-flop blind defense. Class 2, episode 113, that was all about post-flop blind defense. So, in today's class number 3, I will give you my 4-step plan for tackling blind versus blind situations within No Limit Hold'em cash games. So, step number 1 is to set your ranges ahead of time, and I'll give you the cash game ranges that I use in the blinds. Step number 2, it's to know your opponent, and I will tell you what to consider and the HUD stats that can help you dissect every player you come up against. Step 3 is to plan the hand. So this is beneficial for every hand played, regardless of situation. But there are special circumstances that blind versus blind action, it kind of brings about special circumstances that I want to discuss with you. Step 4 is to follow through with your plan. So you've made your plan. Now it's time to stick with it. And finally, I'll wrap up the steps with a few post-flop blind versus blind considerations to take away with you. And I just mentioned that these steps are for cash games. They can and should be used for tournament play as well. But if you're an MTT or sit-and-go grinder, you need to take into account stack sizes and tournament situations as well, because those can have a drastic effect on the way your opponents react to your decisions. And at the end of the podcast, I will introduce you to a new podcast segment called The Nuts. Please visit the show notes page for everything I discussed today, along with a lot of screenshots and links at www.smartpokerstudy.com/pod120. While you're there, you can sign up for the weekly boost for exclusive poker strategy direct to that inbox of yours. Alrighty, let's get to it. Gambate!
And now for our feature presentation.
Okay, so my 4-step plan for blind versus blind confrontations. Step number 1 is set your ranges. Okay, so when I'm first to act in the small blind, I use my button opening range, and I will raise every single hand from that small blind, with that small blind opening opportunity. And why, you ask? Well, it's because this is a great steal opportunity against the right big blind players. I'll steal from them using my 31% button range until they fight back. And you can see a screenshot of my range, the button range, in the show notes. But it's every ace, every pocket pair, every suited king, King 10 off or better, Queen Jack off or better. I love that hand. As well as 6-5 suited or better and 8-6 suited or better. If the big blind starts to fight back with either calls or 3-bets, I'll reassess and I'll often tighten up so I don't get to the flop, out of position because I'm opening in the small blind. So I'll reassess and I might not open as much or I'll just tighten up big time. So that I can fight back against a 3-bet or see those flops with decent ranges, with decent hands, out of position. And when I'm in the big blind and the small blind open limps, I will raise with my entire button range, that same exact range. And why, you ask again? Well, I see that the, small blind open limps, I see that as a super weak and a passive way of saying, hey, please, Mr. Big Blind, may I see a cheap flop? And my answer always is, no, Timmy, it's gonna cost you, buddy. So depending on the small blind player, I'll make it either 3 big blinds if they have a limp fold stat that's pretty high, or I'll make it 4 big blinds if it's going to take a little more work to get them to fold. Another reason for raising over limps is so that you can more profitably Cbet bluff on the flop. So let's say you raise and they call. The flop comes down Ace XX or King XX or even Queen XX. So who has more aces, kings, and queens in their range? You as the raiser or them as the limp caller? Yep, you do. So you want to use that perceived range to your advantage, and you use it to your advantage by C-betting all of those high card flops. And lastly, when the small blind open raises, I use my 20% cutoff opening range. Again, I hear you asking why. I'm super glad that you're feeling so inquisitive today also. But the reason that I use my 20% cutoff opening range is that I have position, and lots of my small blind opponents are just like me, and they open a pretty wide range, and sometimes far too wide. You'll come across players who open raise from the small blind 50 to 60% of the time. That's just way too wide, and it actually makes it pretty difficult for them to defend versus my 3-bet. And it's difficult as well to go post-flop with their super wide range. So my cutoff 20% range, that's actually every suited ace, ace 8 offsuit or better, king 10 suited, and queen 10 suited or better, king queen offsuit, every pocket pair, 6-5 suited or better, and 9-7 suited or better. And of course, me just rattling off the range like this is difficult. So there's a screenshot in the show notes again. And versus that small blind open, I'll either call or 3-bet with that entire range I just discussed. So some of those are 3-betting for value. Some are 3-bet bluffs that I'll fold to a 4-bet. And the rest are just calls because I want to see the flop in position versus this wide small blind range. Now, something else real quick to mention about ranges is that you really don't have to stick with them, Poker is a game about making the best decisions possible. If your range says to open king 10 offsuit from the small blind, but maybe your opponent just never folds and he mostly calls and often 3-bets though, is that king 10 offsuit really worth open raising? Probably not. And you should also consider switching tables versus this guy that just won't fold to your steals, You want to use that poker intellect of yours and decide if a given action, if it'll result in the outcome you're looking for. You'd prefer folds with that king 10 offsuit. It's basically a bluff right there. And if they're never folding, then just don't open it. Okay, so the second step today is know your opponent. So what type of player are you up against? Do they fold a lot, maybe 3-bet a lot, or do they call way too often pre-flop? How about post-flop? Do they fold to Cbets? Are they turn honest? Or are they a station, maybe capable of calling down 3 streets with third pair? The more you know about your opponents, the better. And like I just mentioned, if they won't react the way you want them to, then you may want to change plays or adjust bet sizings to convince them to do what you want. And sometimes we're playing versus an unknown. If that's who you're up against, raise them until they let you know they won't be pushed around. Then adjust accordingly. You should also be looking ahead at their post-flop play before you make your raise or your call or your bet or whatever you're doing, And you want to do that because you want to find out where their weaknesses are post-flop. If they hate folding post-flop, then you should probably only go for value pre-flop. If they readily fold post-flop, then you can pull off some super good bluffs. The more often they fold, the more you want to get into bloated pots with them, especially if you've got position. And here are 5 HUD stats that will tell you loads about your opponent, let me tell you. The first one is the big blind fold versus the small blind steal. And this is key in blind versus blind situations. The higher the better, and anything over 75% deserves to be stolen from freely until they decide to fight back. But if they fold a lot and you've got a premium hand, you may want to raise a little bit less to try to get action from them. The second stat is just the attempt to steal stat. And this is a key stat to help you judge the strength of the small blind's open raise. Anything over 30% deserves at least the consideration of a 3-bet re-steal or a call. But before you 3-bet re-steal, make sure you also look at their 2-bet pre-flop and fold in the small blind stat. That is key. That positional stat will really help you to 3-bet bluff effectively from the big blind. The third stat is 3-bet versus steal. So this is another killer stat to help you gauge how likely the big blind will 3-bet over your small blind open raise. Anything over 8% over a decent sample, that's probably a player who loves to re-steal. Be careful before opening before these blokes, of course. The fourth stat, it's actually kind of a combo stat. It's fold to flop and fold to turn Cbet. And when you look at these stats, you want to consider what street they get honest on. So you know if you will likely have to barrel bluff or maybe just bluffing the flop will be good enough. Also, see how often they fold in position versus out of position as well. And that will help you plan the hand even better. And the last stat is another combo stat. It's c-betting the flop and c-betting the turn. And so, same as the fold to c-bet stats, these help to see how likely you'll be facing bets and barrels post-flop. And you can save yourself some unnecessary pre-flop calling chips if things are looking to get ugly post-flop. So if these guys barrel and you just really don't have a strong hand pre-flop and you don't think you can stand a lot of streets of bets, you'd probably just, prefer folding pre-flop. Alrighty, so the third step is plan the hand. So you're in a blind versus blind confrontation. What are your choices? Well, you can fold, you can limp in the small blind, you can call in the big blind, you can check your big blind if the small blind limps in, and of course, you can raise in either position. So here's the thing though, you've got to think ahead and plan for what your opponent could do in reaction to your bet. If you're in the small blind and you open raise, you should have an idea how you'll approach the flop should they call, and you should also know how you'll respond to a re-raise pre-flop. If you're in the big blind and you raise the limp, you need to have a flop plan for their call, and also know what to do versus their limp re-raise. See, having a plan, it really does help to keep things simple and keeps you from getting surprised. There's an old adage that I really like, though I really don't know who said it. That adage is, if you're surprised by how your opponent responds, then you didn't give it enough thought. So step 4 is to follow through with your plan. You made the plan. Now it's time to stick to it. Maybe you raised with the intent to fold to a re-raise, but your opponent times down and then he does like a little min raise against you. This suddenly feels like a bluff re-raise for sure. Is your king 10 suited now good enough to do battle? Maybe or maybe not. But your intent was to raise as a steal, and a re-raise means you're absolutely beat. Don't go back on your plan just because of the odds being offered. Or maybe you called in the big blind with 8-6 suited, knowing your opponent is very flop honest, and your plan was to bet when you get checked to. When they lead out on that ace-queen-6 board, don't consider calling with your bottom pair hand. Sure, it could of course improve to 2-pair or trips, but this bet equals strength from this opponent because you know they're flop honest, and you're likely just giving them value with your call. Now, you generally want to follow your plan, but when the flop or the turn or the river hits, things can change quickly. Yep, you planned on folding most flops with that speculative 8-6 suited versus that honest c-better. But what if you flop a full house and the opponent leads out? Well, flopping the nuts means, of course, a change of plans is in order. So it's okay to adjust your plans when things take a drastic change on the turn of a card. So those are the 4 steps for planning your blind versus blind confrontations. So let's get into real quick some post-flop play within blind versus blind. So in general, you're going to approach post-flop play like you would at any other time. You're either in position or out of position. Maybe your versus an aggressive or a passive or even a foldy player, Take each situation individually and make a plan for the flop, turn, or river once that flop hits. But one important thing to note about blind versus blind confrontations, it's that we're often dealing with wider ranges. Maybe we opened wide in the small blind, and they called wide in the big blind. Or they open limped in the small blind. We raised a wide range, and they decided to call because they're a bit stationy by nature. Of course, in 3 and 4 bet pots, ranges do start to tighten up, so keep that in mind. But in general, in 2 bet blind versus blind pots, we're looking at pretty wide ranges. So when thinking about wide ranges, they can hit flops pretty hard, of course. Any hand can, but they miss quite often. They also make a lot of mediocre pairs, or they hit weak to strong draws as well. You'll want to take advantage of position when you're in the big blind, and you should put pressure on your opponents because they have those wider ranges that don't hit quite so often. Be a bit more careful in the small blind as they do have position on you. Fold to c-bet in position and fold to c-bet out of position. Those stats are your friends. Pay attention to those dearly, as is, of course, c-bet in position and c-bet out of position. You just want to know as much about your opponent's post-flop game as possible. And something interesting? I was thinking about this earlier today. A calling range of 22%. That consists of broadways, pairs, suited aces, suited connectors, and suited gappers, of course, And there's, in a 22% range, there's actually 257 hands in that range. That range, it only hits top pair or better on ace-high flops about 24% of the time. And you can see a screenshot of this in the show notes. Well, This 22% range, it actually has just over 50 hands that contain an ace, and over 200 non-ace hands. But many of us within blind versus blind confrontations, we get scared when that ace hits the flop. If we don't have one, of course, we get scared. But if your opponent has a wide calling range, and 22% really isn't that wide in today's games, it is a bit wide, but there's a ton of players who call it 22%. If they have that wide of a range, they're likely folding a ton on ace-high boards because no ace in their range is going to scare them, You want to use that flopped ace to your advantage, especially if you were the pre-flop raiser, In his mind, you've got tons of aces in your range, so he's more likely to fold to your Cbet. Conversely, if the ace hits and you get raised or they donk lead into you, it's not the end of the world, especially if they're not really flop honest, if they like to bluff or if they like to just call flops a lot and decide on the turn. If you've got a decent second pair, or maybe a pair plus a draw, it could be worth it to call the flop bet, or even the flop raise and stay in against their unlikely ace. So you should have a general idea of how to approach post-flop play given the likely wide ranges. But keep in mind what I said back in episode number 113. If you're flummoxed, don't flounder, just fold. Don't stay in just because, he's got a wide range and he could be bluffing. Have a reason to stay in beyond the flop. Challenge! Here's my challenge to you for this episode. Open up Flopzilla and do some ace combo counting. How many aces does a 10% calling range have? What about a 15, a 25, or even a 30% calling range? How many aces does a 15% opening range contain? What about a 20 or a 35% opening range? Start doing some work on this off of the tables, and you'll soon realize that an ace on the flop isn't the scariest thing when you're not holding an ace yourself. Now it's your turn to take action and do something positive for your poker game.
Now get it on.
So to recap the episode, you learned the 4 steps for blind versus blind confrontations. Number 1, set your ranges. Number 2, know your opponent. Number 3, plan the hand. And number 4, follow through with your plan. I also gave you the ranges that I play in blind versus blind confrontations. 30% small blind opening range, 30% big blind versus a limp range, and 20% big blind range versus a small blind open raise. You also learned the 5 most important stats to help you understand your opponent and to plan the hand. They were big blind fold versus small blind steal, attempt to steal, 3-bet versus steal, fold to flop and turn Cbet, and of course, Cbet the flop in the turn. And you learned that planning properly and thinking through your options will keep you from surprises and will simplify your game. You also learned that you need to approach post-flop play like any other hand. But in 2-bet, blind versus blind situations, ranges are much wider in general, and they really don't have that many aces to be scared of. And speaking of aces, I gave you a great challenge to push you to do some combo counting and range analysis in Flopzilla. So this episode isn't complete until you head to the show notes page at www.smartpokerstudy.com/pod120. And when you're there, you can find screenshots and links to everything discussed today. And you can discover some ways in which you can support the podcast and keep me keeping on. Notably urgent things to study. Alrighty, so this is a new segment that I'll be adding to every podcast after the recap and before the closing. It's called The Nuts, and that stands for Notably Urgent Things to Study. With every podcast episode, I try to give all my thoughts and try to be extremely thorough with every theme discussed. But these really are just my thoughts. I know that there's so much more you can learn regarding the theme of each episode, and you can learn these from other sources. So The Nuts will give you 2 to 3 additional pieces of content that you can study from somewhere on those interwebs. Maybe it's something I've studied, and maybe it's something I haven't yet, but I plan to in the future. But it should give you some additional insights that I may not have discussed, or maybe I forgot, or I just don't frickin' even know yet, So I've got 3 goals that I'm pursuing with the Nuts segment every week or every episode. Number 1 is to spur you to pursue your own studies. Goal number 2 is to expose you to new ideas. And goal 3 is to expand your online poker resource catalog. So To continue your studies into blind versus blind play, here are 2 pieces of content to study this week. Number 1, last year, Gripst.com, it's always tough for me to say, Gripst.com, he put out a great article and a video called How to Play Blind versus Blind in Tournament Poker. Now, this article really helps tournament players grasp the workings of blind versus blind play in tournaments, and it addresses specific MTT and sit-and-go considerations like stack sizes and tournament stages. And the second thing I want you to study, in general, I don't like limping ever, even open limping in the small blind, but I truly haven't studied the implications or the benefits of limping. But I came across an article on redshippoker.com, and the article is called You Should Limp More Often Pre-Flop. It's a very convincing argument for including limps into your arsenal of plays. It's definitely worth a read, even if you don't start limping into pots, as it will give you some insight into why other players possibly limp. And you can find links to the 2 nuts just mentioned in today's show notes.
That's a lot of nuts!
Thank you so much for listening today. I want your feedback, so hit me with it through the show notes, or you can also send an email to sky@smartpokerstudy.com, tweet it to me @smartpokerstudy, or post it in the Facebook group at www.smartpokerstudy.com/discuss. And please send me those questions, your leaks, or ideas for podcast topics through all the channels just mentioned. Because occasionally, like I did last week, I'll do a podcast topic just based on somebody's recommendation. And some quick shout-outs. Wayne H. supported me for $10 per month on Patreon. Thank you so much, Wayne. John C. purchased my Smart HUD. You rock, John. And Elio F. He purchased Poker Tracker 4 through my affiliate. And, of course, he received the Smart HUD as a gift from me for doing that. So, if you want to support the show like these magnificent specimens of human sexuality, visit the show notes for links to all that you can do, or for all the ways you can support. Alrighty, poker people, I'll be hitting you with another podcast this Friday, and it's going to be about my 2017 Smart Poker goals. You might be thinking, geez, Sky, it's February, it's a little late right now. But hey, I was gone for all of January. So there you have it. February ain't too late at all. Plus, we got still 10 months left in the year, you know? Word of mouth is the best advertising. So a big ol' gracias for sharing this show with other poker people. Your sharing and caring is what helps us grow. Until next time, study smart, play much, and make your next session the best one yet.